My father introduced me to his friends at the 4th of July barbecue the summer I made Brigadier General. He said, "This is my daughter Sandra. She works with the Army. Not in the Army, not for the Army. With the Army. The way you might describe a cafeteria vendor or a base contractor. Someone adjacent to the institution rather than embedded in it across 28 years of service that included 3 combat deployments, 2 commendations, and a promotion that put me in a category containing fewer than 2% of all officers who ever wore the uniform." I smiled at his friends and shook their hands and said it was nice to meet them. "What else do you do?" "My name is Sandra Beaumont. I am 52 years old. I served 28 years in the United States Army as a logistics and operations officer, finishing my career as a brigadier general. I managed supply chains across active conflict zones. I oversaw the movement of personnel and equipment under conditions that required the kind of sustained decision-making that does not leave you the same person you were before you learned how to do it. I deployed to Kuwait, then to Iraq twice. I came home each time changed in ways that accumulated slowly and showed up years later in places I did not expect. My family has 4 generations of military service. My grandfather served in the Second World War as an infantry sergeant in the Pacific Theater. My father served in Vietnam as a Marine Corps corporal. My older brother Gary served in the Gulf War as a Navy petty officer. Their photographs are framed on the wall of my parents' living room in Columbus, Ohio, in chronological order, beside the wooden cross my mother has kept above the mantel my entire life. My photograph is not on that wall. It has never been on that wall. I am the only one who reached the rank of general officer. I am the only one who deployed to active combat zones after the Gulf War era. I am the only one whose service record, measured by any objective military standard, exceeds every other person in the family by a margin that is not particularly close. None of that has ever been the point in the Beaumont house. The point in the Beaumont house was always the men. I want to describe the living room wall because I think it matters more than it should, and I have spent enough years trying to decide whether that is my problem or theirs to know I am not going to resolve it today. The wall runs alongside the staircase in my parents' split level. It is painted a warm ivory that my mother refreshed about 12 years ago and has not touched since. The frames are dark wood, uniform size, arranged in a clean horizontal line at eye level. My grandfather in his army greens, young in the way people look in old photographs when the aging has not happened yet. My father in his Marine Corps dress uniform, 19 years old, jaw set like he was being asked to hold a specific expression and was not entirely sure he was succeeding. Gary in his Navy working uniform, grinning slightly, which was accurate to Gary's personality and always made me feel something affectionate when I looked at it. 3 photographs. 3 men. 3 generations of service, framed and hung and visible to every person who has ever walked through that front door. I noticed the absence of my own photograph for the first time when I was 24. Home on leave after my first duty assignment. I mentioned it once to my mother. She said she was not sure she had a good recent photograph of me in uniform. I was standing in the living room in my uniform at that exact moment. I did not say that. I smiled and went to the kitchen and helped her finish dinner. I did not mention it again for 22 years. The thing about growing up in a military family with that specific structure is that the absence does not announce itself loudly. It is not a door slamming or a name spoken in a certain tone. It is quieter than that. It is the conversation at Thanksgiving that turns to Vietnam and stays there for 2 hours without anyone asking about Mosul. It is the neighbor who stops my father on the porch to thank him for his service and does not know or ask whether anyone else in the family served. It is my brother Gary being introduced at church as a veteran, while I am standing 2 feet to his left in a room full of people who do not know I deployed to the same region he talks about. Just in a different decade and a different uniform, and at a considerably higher rank. It is the accumulation of small silences where acknowledgement could have been. My mother was not cruel. I want to be precise about that because I think precision matters when you are describing someone you love. She was warm and generous and had given everything she had to raise 4 children, 2 of them boys who went into the military and 2 of them girls who did not, except that one of the girls eventually did and stayed for 28 years, and that fact never quite registered in the way the boys' service had. I think she simply did not have a frame for it. Not literally, though that was also true. I mean, she did not have a mental category for a daughter who outranked her husband and her son combined, and who had spent more nights in a combat zone than either of them, and who had made decisions that affected the lives of thousands of people in ways that would never be visible from the living room in Columbus. My father had a frame for it. He just chose not to use it. Here is the conversation I remember most clearly from my childhood, and I remember it clearly because I have turned it over in my mind enough times that the edges have worn smooth. I was 16. Gary had just gotten his acceptance letter to the Naval Academy Preparatory Program. The family celebrated at dinner, my mother's good dishes, the yellow tablecloth reserved for occasions. My father made a toast. He said Gary was going to carry on what the Beaumont men had always stood for: service, sacrifice, the willingness to put something larger than yourself ahead of your own comfort. I asked, carefully, what that meant for me. My father looked at me with genuine kindness, which was somehow harder than if he had looked at me with dismissal. He said I could support Gary, that supporting the people who served was its own form of service. I was 16. I filed that away. 3 years later, I enlisted in the Army. My mother cried from worry. My father said he hoped I knew what I was getting into. Gary, to his credit, drove me to the recruiting office. Nobody made a toast. The wall became significant again when the Veterans Memorial Association in Columbus announced a special exhibition in the spring of my final active duty year. The exhibition was called 4 Generations of Service, a community tribute to military families with multi-generational records of service. They had contacted my parents months earlier after a researcher found the family's combined service history through publicly available military records. The memorial director, a retired Army colonel named Harold Sims, who I had never met, called me directly in February. He had tracked down my contact information through the Army Alumni Network. He explained the exhibition. He said the Beaumont family represented something genuinely unusual: 4 generations, multiple branches, spanning from the Second World War through the present conflicts. He asked if I would be willing to attend the opening and say a few words about the experience of military service as it had evolved across those generations. I had been planning to decline. I had declined similar requests for years, not from false modesty, but from a genuine preference for keeping my personal life separate from my public service record, and from a general wariness about standing in rooms where my family might be used as a backdrop for a story I had not agreed to tell. Harold Sims was patient and specific. He said the exhibition would include materials on all 4 family members, but that having a currently serving general officer present in person would be meaningful to the veterans community in a way that archive photographs could not replicate. I asked him who else from the family had been contacted. He said he had spoken with my father, who had been enthusiastic. I sat with that information for a moment. Then I said I would think about it. I called my sister Renee that evening. Renee is 4 years younger than me and has lived in Columbus her entire life and has therefore had a front row seat to the living room wall situation in a way that I, deployed across most of my adult years, had experienced mainly through visits and phone calls. Renee said, "Are you going?" I said, "I haven't decided." She said, "Dad already told people at church you're coming." I said, "He what?" She said, "He's been telling people for 2 weeks. He says it's going to be the whole family together for the tribute. He's very proud." I was quiet for a moment. Renee said gently, "Sandra." I said, "I know." She said, "Go. But go as yourself." I thought about what that meant for several days. The exhibition opening was on a Saturday afternoon in early May. The memorial building was a converted warehouse near downtown Columbus that the Veterans Association had occupied for about 15 years. Inside, it smelled like wood polish and old paper and the particular mustiness of documents that have been handled and stored and handled again over many decades. The main gallery had been arranged with display panels running along both walls. Photographs, documents, service records, letters home. Each generation of the Beaumont family had a panel of its own. My grandfather's panel included his discharge papers and a photograph of his unit taken somewhere in the Pacific in what the caption dated as late 1944. My father's panel had his enlistment photograph and a letter he had written home from Da Nang that I had never seen before, and that made something in my chest tighten in a way I had not expected. Gary's panel covered his Gulf War service with the precision and affection of a man who had been proud of that period of his life and had talked about it consistently enough that the story was well documented. My panel was at the end of the wall. It was also the largest. Harold Sims had done thorough research. The panel included my enlistment photograph and my officer candidate school graduation photograph and my promotion photograph from each rank progression. It included the citations for both commendations. It included a map of the logistics operations I had overseen in Iraq with annotated notes about scale and complexity. It included my official flag officer photograph, which is the one the Army takes when you pin on general officer rank and which I had always thought made me look slightly more serious than I actually was in daily life. At the top of the panel was a single line that Harold had chosen as a header. It read, Brigadier General Sandra Beaumont, United States Army, retired, 28 years of service, the highest-ranking member of 4 generations of the Beaumont military family. I stood in front of that panel for a long time before the guests arrived. My father found me there about 20 minutes before the opening remarks. He walked up beside me and looked at the panel, and I watched his face from the side and tried to read what I saw there. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They did a good job with all of this." I said, "They did." He said, "Harold said you're going to speak tonight." I said, "Yes." Another silence. My father was 77 years old that spring. He walked more slowly than he used to. His hearing had gotten difficult enough that he wore aids in both ears now, the small kind that disappear if you are not looking for them. He was still a large man, still carried himself with the particular uprightness of someone who had been told to stand straight at 19 and had never fully stopped. He looked at my photograph in the officer candidate school graduation frame, then at the flag officer photograph, then back at me. He said, "I didn't know it was this much." I said, "I know you didn't, Dad." He said, "I should have known." I did not say anything. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't pay closer attention." It was 5 words past what I had ever expected to hear from him in a room or anywhere else. My throat did something I had to manage carefully. I had been managing things carefully in front of my father since I was 16 years old, and I was not going to stop in a memorial gallery 45 minutes before I was scheduled to speak to a room full of people. I said, "Thank you for saying that." He nodded once, the way men of his generation nodded when they had arrived at the outer edge of what they knew how to say and needed the conversation to do the rest on its own. Then he put his hand briefly on my shoulder and walked toward the reception table where my mother was arranging name tags. I stood there for another moment. Then I went to find Harold and confirm the speaking order. The room was full by the time the program started. 200 people, maybe slightly more. Veterans from several eras, families with their own service histories, community members who attended these things because they understood that this kind of remembering mattered. Several people I recognized from the Army network. A few local officials. A reporter from the Columbus Dispatch who had photographed the exhibition panels earlier and was now sitting near the back with a notepad. Harold opened with remarks about the exhibition and about the Beaumont family's contribution to the community's military history. He introduced my grandfather's service first, then my father's, then Gary's. Gary stood and received applause, and nodded with the particular combination of pride and slight embarrassment that Gary had always brought to public acknowledgement. Then Harold introduced me. He read from the citations. He described the deployments. He said the words Brigadier General slowly, with the weight they deserved, and the room responded with the kind of attention that settles over people when they understand they are in the presence of something they had not fully expected. I walked to the podium. I looked at the room. 200 people. My mother in the 4th row with her hands folded in her lap. My father beside her, hearing aids in, watching me with an expression I did not have a name for. Gary near the aisle, Renee in the back, nodding slightly in the way that meant she was with me. I said, "My grandfather came home from the Pacific in 1945 and never talked about what he had seen there. I understand that now in a way I could not have understood it at 20. There are things you carry home from certain places that do not translate into dinner table conversation, that exist in the body rather than in language, that you protect the people you love from by keeping quiet." I paused. I said, My father carried something home from Vietnam that shaped everything about how our family understood service and sacrifice, and what it meant to put something larger than yourself ahead of your own comfort. He taught me that, directly and by example, and I have thought about his example in difficult moments more times than I could count. I looked at my father. He was very still. I said, I joined the army at 19 because I believed what my family had taught me about service. I stayed for 28 years because I found I was good at it, and because the work mattered, and because every time I thought about stopping, I could not identify anything I wanted to do more. I took a slow breath. I said, I am aware that my service was not always visible in the same way that the service of the other members of my family was visible. That the work I did happened at a scale and in contexts that were difficult to explain across a kitchen table. That the promotions and the commendations and the deployments did not always register in the places closest to home the way I might have hoped they would. The room was completely quiet. I said, I am not here tonight to correct that. I am here because a man named Harold Sims did careful research and built a panel on that wall that tells the accurate story, and because I think accurate stories matter, especially the ones that take a long time to get told. I looked at the panel on the wall behind me. My graduation photographs, my commendation citations, the flag officer photograph with its expression slightly more serious than my daily reality. I said, the Beaumont family has given something real to this country across 4 generations. I am proud to be part of that. I am proud to be the last chapter of it, at least so far. I left the last part there without completing it, and let the room decide what it meant. The applause started before I stepped back from the podium. My mother found me near the reception table about half an hour after my remarks. She was holding a small plate of food she had not eaten, and she had been crying recently in the careful way she cried, which was without making noise and with a tissue pressed to one corner of each eye in sequence. She hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Then she stepped back and looked at me and said, I want to put your photograph on the wall. I said, Mom. She said, I mean it. When we get home. I want to put it next to your father's. I looked at her for a moment. 69 years old, the tissue still in her hand, her good earrings catching the gallery light. I said, I would like that. She nodded and pressed her lips together and patted my arm and went back to organizing things, because organizing things was how my mother processed emotion and had been for as long as I could remember. I stood there holding my own untouched plate. Renee appeared beside me. She said, Well. I said, Well. She said, How do you feel? I thought about it honestly. I said, like something that has been sitting crooked for a very long time just got straightened. She put her arm around my shoulder. We stood there together for a while as the room moved around us and the light in the gallery went golden with the late afternoon coming through the high windows. My photograph went up on the wall 2 weeks after the exhibition. My mother called to tell me. She described exactly where she had hung it, between my father's and Gary's, in a frame that matched the others. She said she had moved Gary's slightly to the left to make the spacing even. I was standing in my kitchen in Alexandria when she called, the same kitchen where I had stood for years making coffee in the mornings before heading to the Pentagon or to whatever assignment had me that season. I looked out the window at the familiar view of the parking lot and the tree line beyond it and felt something I am still trying to name precisely. Not vindication. That word has too much edge to it, implies a contest that was won, and I do not think of it that way. More like a rival, like a thing that had been in transit for a very long time had finally reached its destination and been set down in the right place. I thanked her. She said, You should have been up there from the beginning. I said, Maybe. But now I am. She said, Now you are. We talked for a while about other things. Her garden, which was doing well that spring. My nephew's graduation, which was coming up in June. The drive she and my father were planning through the Shenandoah Valley once the weather settled. Normal things. The kind of conversation that means the hard part is behind you and what remains is just the ordinary continuation of a life being lived. I have thought about what I would want someone to take from this story if they have stayed with me long enough to reach this part. I do not think my family was exceptional in the specific way they failed to see me. I think they were ordinary, which is a harder thing to reckon with because it means the pattern is common and the people living inside it are usually not villains. My father loved me. He simply had a framework for understanding service that had been built entirely around men, and I did not fit that framework, and he lacked the flexibility to rebuild it around what I actually was. That is not a defense of what he did. It is just the most accurate description I have of it. What I know is that I did not spend 28 years waiting for his acknowledgement. I could not have survived 28 years if I had been doing it for anyone's approval, including his. I did it because it was mine to do, because the work was real, and the responsibility was real, and the people I was responsible for deserved everything I had to give. The wall in Columbus was never the measure of that. But standing in the Memorial Gallery on a Saturday in May and watching 200 people read the accurate version of my service history on a panel at the end of a wall, that mattered. Not because I needed the room to know, because I needed my father to know, and he did not know until Harold Sims built a panel that made it impossible to look away from. Sometimes the truth needs a good frame, sometimes it needs someone outside the family to put it up. My grandfather is gone. My father will be gone someday. Gary and Renee and I will be gone someday. The Army will keep going without any of us, which is how it should be and how we would all want it. What remains is the record, the documented fact of what each person did and where they went and what they carried home. The photographs on the wall in Columbus, 4 of them now, arranged in order with the spacing even. 4 generations, 4 frames, the full story. I did not win anything by being on that wall. I was always supposed to be there. It just took 28 years, and a man named Harold Sims and a Saturday afternoon in May for the rest of my family to catch up to what the Army had known about me since I was 19 years old. That is the whole story. It has always been enough.